Hello everyone, and welcome back to Whispers at Night. Tonight we journey deep into the most isolated and unforgiving reaches of the Appalachian Mountains, where the grip of civilization fades and something far older and more primal takes over. In this episode, we reveal 10 chilling encounters with feral humans who have rejected society and embraced a savage life hidden within the ancient wilderness. These are not myths or tall tales, but authentic accounts from geologists, park rangers, hunters, and researchers who unexpectedly came across communities living outside the bounds of modern civilization. Each story has been thoroughly verified through multiple reports, physical evidence, and witness statements, revealing a terrifying glimpse into human regression in America's last great wilderness. To protect those involved, some names and locations have been changed, but the heart of these encounters remains unchanged and deeply unsettling. These witnesses have chosen to share their experiences as a warning to anyone who might wander too far into the mountains, where humanity fades and something else takes over. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe to Whispers at Night for daily true horror stories that expose the hidden terrors lurking in the shadows of our world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the secrets others tried to keep hidden. Now, let's begin our descent into the dark heart of the Appalachian wilderness. My name is Samuel, and I was born into a family of hunters in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Hunting, for us, was never just about sport or trophies. It was part of who we were, a rhythm tied to the land and the passing of seasons. From the time I was old enough to hold a rifle, my father and grandfather were teaching me how to move quietly through the undergrowth, how to track a deer through scattered signs, how to respect the forest even as we lived from it. Autumn was always the most important time. The cool air, the blaze of crimson and amber leaves, the crunch beneath your boots. It meant the woods came alive in a way that stirred something deep inside. But all those years of campfire talk, of stories shared on long nights about strange sightings and unsettling sounds, never prepared me for what I experienced one fateful morning. What I encountered that day in the wilderness shook me to my core, and even now, decades later, I hesitate to share it. I woke before dawn, the world outside still wrapped in darkness. The cabin creaked in the cold, a draft whispering through old cracks in the wood. My breath was visible in the air as I pulled on my thick wool socks and laced up the boots that had carried me through countless hunts. The faint smell of burnt wood clung to the room from the night's fire, mingling with the sharp scent of pine that always seemed to seep in from outside. This was the season every hunter in these mountains anticipated. The rut. A powerful buck had been spotted roaming not far from town, antlers wide and proud, the kind that became local legend. I had tracked him for weeks, following prints, scat, and rubs, convinced that if I was patient enough, I might get the chance for a perfect shot. That morning, I felt certain it would be the day. I packed carefully, the ritual as important as the hunt itself. My grandfather's old rifle, Paulus, he'd but aged, went into its case. A few boxes of ammunition, a thermos of water, jerky for the long hours, and a small kit of supplies in case of injury. These items had always been standard for me, but recently I'd begun bringing a camera as well, hoping to capture the beauty of the land as much as the hunt. With my pack secured, I stepped outside. Mist hung heavy, curling low among the trees like something alive. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of my boots on gravel. There was a crisp bite to the air, a whisper of the first frost to come. I took my truck along a narrow logging road, winding deeper into the mountains. The path was rugged, with sharp turns and steep drops that kept me cautious. Eventually, the road ended, giving way to an overgrown trailhead. From there, it was foot travel only. I slung my pack over my shoulder, adjusted my rifle, and pressed into the woods. This section of the forest was avoided by many locals. Stories about strange happenings had circulated for years, whispers on the wind, movements that couldn't be explained, places where compasses spun without reason. I had always dismissed those tales as exaggerations, folklore meant to pass time on porches and around fires. But the moment I stepped off the path, a weight seemed to press down on me. The canopy overhead let shafts of light filter through in broken fragments, scattering patterns across mossy rocks and tangled roots. The forest floor was damp and uneven, littered with fallen branches that cracked underfoot. I checked my compass often, aware that even for a seasoned hunter, these woods could become disorienting quickly. As I searched for the buck, I read the signs around me: fresh scrapes against tree bark, deep hoof prints pressed into soft earth, a snapped branch that revealed recent movement. Each clue built anticipation inside me, sharpening my focus, pushing me forward. By midday, I found myself at a small clearing where sunlight slipped down through the branches. At first glance, it looked like the perfect spot to pause, but something about it felt wrong. The air was too still. The forest, usually full of subtle sound, was silent. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, nothing but the faint sigh of wind through the treetops. The hairs along my neck prickled. I had the sense that eyes were on me. Movement caught my peripheral vision, a shifting shadow near a gnarled oak. My hand tightened on my rifle as I scanned the trees. Nothing. The silence pressed closer, suffocating. I called out. Just a simple greeting meant more for myself than anything else. But the sound seemed swallowed whole, absorbed by the woods without echo. The sunlight dimmed unnaturally, shadows stretching too far, too fast. A coldness gripped me despite the warmth of the autumn afternoon. Old warnings my grandfather used to mutter returned unbidden. Tales of watchers in the forest, spirits older than the mountains themselves. I had always laughed at those stories. But then, I saw it. A figure, tall and distorted, stood among the trunks. It blended almost perfectly with bark and branch, yet its faintly glowing eyes gave it away. My voice faltered as I demanded it show itself. The figure did not move. My pulse hammered in my ears. I pushed deeper into the woods, marking my path with strips of cloth tied to branches. But the deeper I went, the heavier the air became. The forest closed in, twisting, reshaping itself into unfamiliar forms. Footsteps echoed behind me, deliberate and heavy. I spun, but saw nothing. Panic began to gnaw at my thoughts. A snap to my left brought my rifle up instinctively. There it was again, dark, motionless, watching. I fired a warning shot. The crack of the gun rang out, but strangely muffled, as though the trees themselves swallowed the nose. We see. And in that instant, the figure melted into shadow, vanishing as though it had never been. I ran. The forest seemed alive, closing behind me, confusing my sense of direction. My desperate calls for help vanished into the void. No familiar landmarks guided me, no trail appeared. It was as if the land itself wanted me lost. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours, I couldn't say. Eventually, I stumbled across a dark cave mouth carved into the hillside. Desperate for cover, I ducked inside. The air was cold, damp, heavy with the scent of rot. The silence was crushing, pressing against my ears. Then, from deeper within, came a sound, low, guttural chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Fear surged through me. Instinct screamed at me to get out. I turned to flee, but outside the cave entrance, I found footprints, bare, wide, and inhuman. Against every rational thought, I followed where they led, deeper into the forest. They brought me to a clearing, and what I saw there still haunts my dreams. Stones arranged in a circle, precise and ancient-looking. At the center, a freshly dug pit, symbols carved around its edges that glowed faintly in the fading light. Figures stood around the circle, twisted, cloaked in moss and bark, faces hidden behind bone masks. They swayed as they chanted, voices rising in dreadful unison. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, as one, they stopped and turned their heads toward me. A roar erupted, primal and furious. The chase began. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the woods, heart pounding, lungs burning. Their pursuit was impossible, their speed inhuman, their silence unbearable. Every sound behind me told me they were closing in. I stumbled across a stream, cold water soaking my legs, but it gave me no relief. I fell, pain shooting through my knee, and when I glanced back, the figures were nearly upon me, grotesque masks gleaming in the dim light. Adrenaline dragged me to my feet and I ran, pushing past exhaustion. The forest twisted, paths shifting like a living maze. Somehow, I burst into another clearing, the same stone circle. Only now, the pit seemed to breathe, and the symbols carved into the ground glowed brighter. The figures swayed again, chanting louder, their bodies contorting unnaturally. Bark and moss pulsed across their skin as if alive. It was no hunt now. It was a crossing into something older, darker, a world not meant for us. I don't know how long I ran, only that eventually the trees broke and the logging road appeared ahead. The pale light of dawn filtered over the hills. With what strength I had left, I stumbled to my truck, slammed the door shut, and drove without looking back. Even now, I can still feel their presence when I enter certain parts of the forest. Places where the shadows are too thick, where the silence feels alive, where the wind carries whispers that don't belong to this world. Since that day, I've never hunted alone. My family taught me respect for the land, but that morning I learned respect is not enough. The mountains hold secrets, and some doors once opened can never be shut. I have been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Black bears wandering into campsites, lost hikers who had strayed miles from marked trails, even the occasional marijuana grow operation hidden deep in the forest. But nothing in my training or experience prepared me for what I discovered during my patrol of the Pisgah National Forest in October of 2019. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I work out of the Asheville District Office. That particular morning started like any other. I loaded my truck with supplies, checked my radio, and headed out to inspect the remote sections of Trail 482, a lesser-known path that winds through some of the densest woodland in our jurisdiction. The area sees maybe a dozen visitors per month, mostly serious hikers looking to escape the crowds that flock to the more popular trails near the Blue Ridge Parkway. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and that distinctive mountain freshness that never gets old. I parked at the trailhead around 7 o'clock in the morning and began my routine inspection, checking for storm damage, illegal camping, and ensuring the trail markers remained visible and accurate. Everything appeared normal for the first 3 miles. It was when I reached the section known locally as Devil's Hollow that I noticed something was different. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, not even the constant buzz of insects that typically fills these woods. The silence was so profound it felt like walking through a cathedral, except this quiet carried in weight that pressed against my chest. I stopped walking and listened carefully. In 15 years of working these mountains, I had learned to trust my instincts, and every fiber of my being was telling me that something was fundamentally wrong. Hair on my arm stood up beneath my ranger jacket, and I found myself scanning the treeline with an intensity I had never felt before during a routine patrol. That was when I saw it through the trees about 50 yards off the main trail. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light filtering through the autumn canopy. But as I moved closer, pushing through the thick undergrowth of mountain laurel and rhododendron, I realized I was looking at something that should not exist in these woods. It was a staircase. Not the wooden steps that we sometimes install for difficult terrain, but an elaborate stone staircase that appeared to be carved from a single massive piece of granite. The steps were perfectly uniform, each one exactly the same height and depth, rising up into the forest at a gentle angle before disappearing into the thick canopy above. I counted 43 visible steps before the staircase vanished into the shadows between the trees. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each step had been polished smooth, and despite being covered with fallen leaves, I could see that the stone showed no signs of weathering or age. There were no tool marks visible, no joints or seams that would indicate the staircase had been assembled from multiple pieces. It looked as though someone had taken a mountain and carved these steps directly from its heart, but that was impossible. I knew every inch of this forest. I had studied topographical maps, aerial photographs, and historical surveys dating back to the early 1900s. There was no record of any structure, no mention of quarrying operations, and certainly no explanation for how such a massive stone staircase could exist in the middle of a federally protected wilderness area. I pulled out my radio to report the discovery, but all I received was static. This was strange because I typically maintained clear communication with base throughout this section of trail. I tried my cell phone and found no signal, which was not unusual given our location, but the timing felt unsettling. As I stood there studying the staircase, I noticed that the silence around me had become even more pronounced. The forest felt frozen, as though time itself had stopped in this small pocket of the mountains. Even the leaves had stopped falling, hanging motionless in the air, as if suspended by invisible threads. That was when I felt the pull. It started as a gentle tugging sensation in my chest, like being drawn by a magnet. I found my feet moving toward the base of the staircase without any conscious decision on my part. The feeling was similar to the compulsion you might experience when standing at the edge of a high cliff, except instead of wanting to jump, I felt an overwhelming urge to climb. I forced myself to stop at the bottom step. The stone was warm beneath my boot, which made no sense given the cool October air. As I stood there, the pulling sensation grew stronger. It was as though something at the top of the staircase was calling to me, promising answers to questions I had never thought to ask. My rational mind kicked in. The training and protocols that had kept me safe for 15 years in these mountains. I stepped back from the staircase and pulled out my digital camera to document what I had found. But when I reviewed the photos on the camera's small screen, they showed only empty forest. No staircase, no carved stone steps, just trees and undergrowth. I looked up from the camera and the staircase was still there, as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. I took several more photos, but each one showed the same thing. Normal Appalachian forest with no sign of any stone structure. The pulling sensation was becoming harder to resist. I found myself taking another step toward the staircase, then another. The warm stone felt good beneath my boots, and with each step upward, the compulsion grew stronger. At the 5th step, I could hear something that might have been music, or might have been voices drifting down from the hidden top of the staircase. At the 10th step, I realized I could no longer remember why I had been hesitant to climb. The staircase felt like the most natural thing in the world, as though I had been walking these steps my entire life. The forest around me began to change. The familiar oak and hickory trees giving way to species I could not identify with bark that seemed to shimmer and leaves that moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. It was at the 15th step that I heard my name being called. Not by a human voice, but by something that sounded like the forest itself speaking. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the stone beneath my feet and the trees around me. "Marcus," it said in a voice like wind through caves. "Marcus, come home." That word home snapped me back to awareness like a physical blow. This was not my home. My home was a small house outside Asheville with a mortgage and a dog named Scout, and neighbors who borrowed my lawnmower. Whatever was calling to me from the top of these impossible steps was not offering me anything I wanted. I turned and ran down the staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time. Behind me, the voice grew louder and more insistent, no longer sounding like wind, but like something ancient and hungry that had been waiting far too long for company. By the time I reached the bottom, the voice had become a roar that seemed to shake the very ground. I did not stop running until I reached my truck. When I looked back toward the forest, I could see nothing unusual through the trees, just the normal woodland shadows of an October afternoon. My radio crackled back to life, and I could hear my supervisor trying to reach me for a routine check-in. I never reported the staircase officially. Who would have believed me? More importantly, who might have wanted to investigate it? Instead, I quietly researched the history of that particular section of forest, diving deep into archives and old records. What I found kept me awake for months. In 1923, a surveying team had gone missing in Devil's Hollow while mapping the area for the newly established National Forest. Their equipment was found scattered along what is now Trail 482, but the five-man team was never located. The final entry in their field notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described stone steps leading up into nothing and complained that their compasses had stopped working. In 1954, a family of 4 disappeared while camping in the same area. Their campsite was discovered intact, with food still cooking over their fire and personal belongings scattered around as though they had simply walked away mid-meal. The search lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles, but no trace of the family was ever found. There were other incidents. A hiker in 1967 who was found wandering naked and incoherent near the trail, claiming he had climbed to the top but could not find his way down. A group of college students in 1985 who reported seeing impossible architecture before 2 of their party vanished during the night. Each incident was investigated, filed, and eventually forgotten by everyone except the families left behind. I have not returned to that section of trail since October 2019. I submitted a report recommending that portion of Trail 482 be temporarily closed for geological instability, a recommendation that was accepted without question. The area remains off-limits to hikers, marked with warnings about unstable terrain and potential rockfall. But sometimes, especially on quiet October nights when the air carries that particular mountain crispness, I can still feel the pull. It tugs at something deep in my chest, promising answers and calling me home to a place I have never been. And sometimes when I am patrolling other sections of the forest, I catch glimpses of stone through the trees. Smooth, polished surfaces that vanish when I look directly at them. I have started carrying a compass on every patrol now, though I am not sure what I will do if it ever stops working, because I know the staircase is still there, waiting in Devil's Hollow. Waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to climb all the way to the top and discover what has been calling from the shadows above the tree line. And I know that someday, despite every rational thought in my head, despite 15 years of training and experience, I am going to answer that call. The pull grows stronger every year, and I am not sure how much longer I can resist the invitation to come home to a place that should not exist. Up steps that lead to nowhere anyone has ever returned from. The forest keeps its secrets well, but some secrets do not want to stay buried, and some staircases are meant to be climbed no matter how much better judgment warns you to walk away. My name is Daniel, and what I'm about to tell you has haunted me for the past 3 years. It happened in the Appalachian Mountains, a place I thought I knew better than anywhere else. Hiking had been my passion for nearly 2 decades. I'd walked sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, pushed through the high passes of the Rockies, and even tested myself on stretches of the Continental Divide. But the Blue Ridge Mountains, especially the Shenandoah section, had always been my comfort zone, my second home. I had walked those trails so many times I could picture every landmark in my head. I was convinced I couldn't get lost there if I tried. That arrogance nearly destroyed me. It was October of 2022. One of those autumns where the entire forest feels like it's on fire with color. Gold, red, deep orange. The trees looked like they were painted by some artist who didn't know when to stop. I had been craving some solitude and decided on a simple day hike. Nothing complicated, nothing risky. I chose the White Oak Canyon Trail, a route I'd taken more times than I could count. It was supposed to be a casual outing, a way to stretch my legs, breathe in the crisp mountain air, and be back to my truck by dusk. I set out just after sunrise, around 7 in the morning. The air was cool, mist clinging low in the valleys, rolling like waves between the hills. That kind of mist makes the mountains feel like they're alive, breathing slowly beneath you. I parked at the same trailhead I had used for years, the same gravel lot with the weathered wooden sign. My boots hit the dirt, and everything felt familiar, comforting, safe. For the first few miles, nothing seemed out of place. I passed the stone bridge I'd always admired, ran my hand along the rough split of that strange oak tree that bent in two directions, and paused briefly by the little waterfall that usually trickled like a leaky faucet this time of year. Other hikers were out too, giving the usual smiles and nods. For a while, it felt like any other perfect day in the mountains. But something shifted around mile 4. I stopped at a boulder near the overlook, one of my favorite resting spots. I'd sat on that very rock dozens of times, eating snacks and watching the valley stretch out beneath me. That day, though, the view looked different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the valley seemed deeper somehow, as if it had sunk. And slicing right through it was a road, a dark line of asphalt I had never seen before. I knew every road in that area. There shouldn't have been one there. I convinced myself it was just the change in foliage playing tricks on me. Autumn alters the landscape in small ways, opening views you usually can't see in the summer. That explanation was good enough to quiet my nerves, and I pressed on. Yet the deeper I walked, the more wrong things began to feel. The trail narrowed, almost like the forest was reclaiming it. The painted blazes that marked the route became harder to find. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen flickered with static, refusing to lock onto a signal. That had happened before in these mountains, so I told myself not to panic. Still, something in my chest felt tight, uneasy. The canopy above thickened, leaves locking together like puzzle pieces until barely a drop of sunlight could pierce through. The bright October morning dimmed into a dusky twilight. The air grew heavy, damp. What unsettled me most wasn't the darkness, it was the silence. These woods had always been alive with sound. Birds, squirrels, wind, distant hikers, even the faint hum of planes overhead. But now there was nothing. Not a chirp, not a rustle. Just the steady beat of my own footsteps and the sound of my breathing, which seemed louder than it should have been. I turned around, deciding it was best to head back toward the overlook. But the trail I had just walked wasn't there. Instead, a narrow, uneven deer path snaked into the undergrowth. My stomach sank. In all my years of hiking, I had never once been genuinely lost, and realizing it now sent panic surging through me. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was just disorientation. If I kept moving, I'd eventually reconnect with the main trail. That's what I believed. But the farther I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees loomed larger, impossibly wide, their trunks twisted and scarred as if they had endured centuries of storms. They weren't the same species I had been passing earlier. Some of them didn't even look like trees I recognized. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. My skin prickled with the sensation of eyes on me, yet whenever I turned, all I saw was the endless weave of branches and shadows. Time grew slippery. My watch said it was 2:30 in the afternoon, but the light filtering through the leaves had the orange glow of sunset. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air carried a smell I still struggled to describe. It was earthy, yes, like damp soil and decaying leaves, but there was something sharper beneath it, metallic almost. Wrong. That's when I heard the voice. At first faint, so faint I thought I imagined it. It was human, at least it sounded human, but the words were garbled, distorted, bouncing strangely between the trees. My chest tightened. Relief fought with fear. If it was another hiker, I wasn't alone. But there was something in the tone that made my gut twist. I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness. The sound seemed swallowed whole by the forest. No echo, no carry, just gone. The voice came again, closer this time. Not a call for help, not the panicked cry of someone lost. It was softer, coaxing, beckoning. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to move away. My legs disobeyed. I started jogging, pushing through branches that clawed at me like hands. What should have been flexible twigs struck like wires, cutting my arms, scraping my face. Roots rose like traps, and I stumbled more than once, falling hard onto rocks that felt sharper than they should have been. My palms bled, burning as though I'd scraped them across glass. The voice grew louder, urgent now, overlapping itself in strange echoes, and with it came another sound. Footsteps. Not behind me, not ahead, beside me. Something moved parallel to me in the trees, matching my pace effortlessly. My eyes caught flickers of movement, shadows darting, but whenever I turned my head there was nothing there, only that endless dark forest pressing closer and closer. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs screamed, my legs trembled, but I couldn't stop. Then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the forest broke open. I stumbled out onto asphalt, collapsing to my knees. A paved road stretched in both directions. My mind reeled. No road should have been here, not in this section of wilderness. I barely had time to gather myself before headlights appeared around a bend. An old pickup truck slowed beside me. The driver, a weathered man with silver hair and lines carved deep into his face, leaned across the seat. His eyes met mine, and I swear he looked at me with recognition, like he'd seen this before. He didn't ask questions. He simply opened the door with a nod. I climbed in, still gasping, shaking. The man drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes. The forest outside looked ordinary again, the same Blue Ridge trees I'd always known. But when I tried to look back, to pinpoint where I had emerged, the tree line gave me nothing but the same unbroken green. It was as if the place I had just come from had sealed itself shut. When he dropped me at the trailhead where my truck waited, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the lot. My GPS showed I was exactly where I should be, but my hiking app showed nothing. No record of distance, time, or elevation, as if the entire day had been erased. Before I could say anything, the old man finally spoke, his voice low and even. "Stay on the marked trails, son. These mountains have rules of their own. Folks who don't follow them don't always come back." I watched him drive away, dust kicking up from his tires, leaving me alone with those words echoing in my ears. My boots, which should have been caked in mud and worn from hours of hiking, looked almost untouched. My water bottles were still full, though I should have been dangerously dehydrated. The scratches on my arms and face throbbed, but even they seemed strange, more like cuts from something sharper than branches. Since that day, I've gone back to the Appalachians, but never again off the marked paths. I stick to the blazes like my life depends on it, because maybe it does. Sometimes, though, when the forest grows too quiet, I catch sight of faint trails leading off into the shadows, trails that don't exist on any map. And when the wind dies down completely, if I hold still and strain to listen, I can hear it again. That voice, patient and persistent, still calling, waiting for someone else foolish enough to follow. My name is Delilah Mae Sutherland, and I have lived all my life in the small town of Beckley, West Virginia. My grandmother, a woman filled with old Appalachian wisdom, told me stories about the deep hollows tucked away in the mountains before I was even tall enough to reach the kitchen table. Among all her tales, the one I remember most vividly was about Whispering Hollow, a place she warned was forbidden after nightfall. "Never go near there after dark," she would say in a voice filled with both fear and reverence, "for the singing will steal your soul away." Like most children, I dismissed these stories as superstition. My grandmother had dozens of warnings about the mountains. Do not whistle in the woods, never follow a crying baby, and always carry iron in your pocket. But as I grew older and heard more whispered accounts from hunters, neighbors, and old-timers down at Miller's General Store, the legend of Whispering Hollow took on a life of its own, becoming more than mere myth in my mind. The hollow was a dense, almost impenetrable forest cloaked in shadows and an unnatural silence that fell with the setting sun. What made Whispering Hollow different from the other mountain tales was the consistency of the stories. Everyone described the same haunting melody, the same irresistible pull, and the same tragic endings for those who ventured too close after dark. My great-uncle Henry had lost his hunting dog there in 1952. The animal was found 3 days later at the edge of the hollow, alive but changed. its eyes vacant and its bark forever silenced. My tale begins the summer I turned 19. I just graduated from high school, restless and filled with a desperate need to prove I was no longer the scared child who trembled when the wind stirred the leaves. That restless energy combined with the typical arrogance of youth drove me to convince a small group of friends, classmates from Charleston who were visiting for the weekend, to join me on a hike through Whispering Hollow. They had never heard the local legends, and their skepticism only fueled my determination to show them that the old stories were nothing but mountain superstition. "Come on, Delilah," my friend Marcus laughed when I mentioned the hollow. "You really believe your grandmother's ghost stories? Next, you will be telling us about Bigfoot and UFOs." Their mockery stung more than I cared to admit. I had spent my entire life being dismissed as the backward mountain girl by classmates from more urban parts of the state. This felt like my chance to prove that I was beyond such foolish beliefs, even as a small voice in my head whispered that some beliefs exist for very good reasons. We set out at mid-afternoon on a sweltering June day, the sun filtering dimly through the thick canopy of chestnut and oak trees. The forest floor was a mosaic of dried leaves and moss, muffling our footsteps as we ventured deeper into terrain that grew progressively wilder. The stillness of the place was palpable, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or a whispered rush of the wind through the treetops. With each step forward, the weight of the stories I had heard seemed to settle heavier on my shoulders. What struck me first was how the usual forest sounds gradually faded away. The chatter of squirrels, the calls of birds, even the buzz of insects slowly diminished until we walked in an eerie quiet that felt almost reverent. My friends continued their jokes and laughter, but I noticed their voices growing softer, as though the forest itself demanded respect. As daylight began to fade, transforming the forest into a twilight realm where shadows thickened like smoke, the singing began. At first, it was like the mere rustling of leaves, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. Then the melody emerged, a delicate, sorrowful tune that seemed to weave itself through the very air, filling the hollow with its haunting presence. It was a song filled with longing and loss, simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling as we all paused on the narrow deer path we had been following. "It sounds like someone is singing." I nodded, my heart pounding wildly. The music was unlike anything I had ever heard in the natural world. It held a strange power drawing us forward with an irresistible gravity. The legend was not just a story. The hollow was alive with the voices of the lost, just as my grandmother had warned. My friend Marcus, who had been so skeptical earlier, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open. "That is impossible," he murmured. "We are miles from any houses. Who could be singing out here?" We pushed onward, drawn by curiosity and something deeper that I now realize was not entirely our own will. The path led us past the twisted trunks of ancient trees whose knotted roots tangled across the ground like arthritic fingers. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and somewhere in the distance we could hear the gentle trickle of running water. Eventually, the trees opened into a clearing that took my breath away. A circle of giant moss-covered stones stood like silent sentinels beneath the emerging stars. These were not natural rock formations. They had been placed there deliberately, arranged in a perfect circle that measured perhaps 30 feet across. The stones themselves looked centuries old, their surfaces worn smooth by time and covered with a patchwork of lichens and ivy that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Within the circle stood a figure that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. She was small and slight, appearing to be no more than a child, yet there was something ancient about her presence. Her skin was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and her dark hair hung in long, straight curtains that seemed to move with a breeze I could not feel. But it was her eyes that held me captive. They shimmered with an eerie light that seemed to glow from within, reflecting depths that no human eyes should possess. She sang, her voice blending perfectly with the ethereal melody that filled the night air, weaving threads of sorrow and comfort in the same breath. The song had no words that I could understand, yet somehow it spoke directly to my heart, telling stories of loss and loneliness that stretched back through generations. "Stay a while," she sang softly, the words forming clearly now in English. "Safe from the night, safe from the sorrow. Rest here where the singing never ends." That voice, sweet, hypnotic, and impossibly compelling, rooted me to the spot. It was as if the path I had walked along was slipping away beneath my feet, and the only direction left was toward her, deeper into the circle of ancient stones. Everything else, my friends, my life in Beckley, my plans for the future began to fade like half-remembered dreams. My friends called out, alarm creeping into their voices. "Delilah, come back, something is wrong here." But I was paralyzed by the song and the pull of the mysterious figure. The hollow seemed to close in around me, thickening the air with its cold embrace, while the temperature dropped noticeably. It was then that the secrets of Whispering Hollow began to unravel before my eyes, revealed in the haunting melody that seemed to tell its own story. The figure was not just a lost child, but the spectral daughter of a time long forgotten, a tragic survivor of the mountain families who once lived peacefully in these hills before the coal mines and steel mills swallowed their homes and way of life. As her song continued, images flashed through my mind like fragments of an old film reel. Families gathering in these hills for harvest celebrations, children playing among the stone circle during happier times, and then the coming of industry and progress that scattered the mountain folk like leaves in the wind. According to the vision her song painted, there had been a cruel winter in the late 1800s when the mountain spirits, angered by the destruction of their sacred places, laid a curse on the last family to leave the hollow. The father had buried his wife and children beneath the snow during that terrible season, and his grief had twisted into something dark and vengeful. His surviving daughter, left alone in the hollow, was bound by his dying curse to wander forever, singing a melody that would soothe the restless spirits while drawing the living deeper into the forest's embrace. The hollow itself had become a trap, cursed to lure in those who dared enter after dark, drawing wanderers closer with its irresistible song until they were lost forever, swallowed by the forest and remembered only in the whispers that floated on the wind during quiet mountain nights. As this ribble understanding washed over me, I watched in horror as my friends began to disappear, one by one, swallowed by the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They did not scream or call out. They simply walked forward with peaceful expressions on their faces, drawn by the same compulsion that held me captive. And then they were gone as though they had never existed at all. The singing girl turned her glowing eyes toward me and smiled, extending one pale hand in invitation. "Come," she whispered, her voice now carrying the echo of centuries. "Join us in the song that never ends. Find peace in the hollow where time stands still." It was my grandmother's voice that saved me. Not literally, but the memory of her warnings that suddenly flooded back with startling clarity. "Iron child," I remembered her saying. "Cold iron breaks any mountain curse." Without understanding why, I reached into my pocket and grasped the small iron key to my truck, a simple piece of metal that suddenly felt as powerful as any talisman. The moment my fingers closed around the iron key, the spell shattered like glass. The singing became a shriek of rage. The beautiful clearing revealed itself as a tangle of dead trees and scattered bones, and I ran with a desperation born of pure terror. I fled through the forest as branches clawed at my arms and face, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, the singing pursued, No longer beautiful, but filled with fury and hunger. I stumbled over roots, crashed through underbrush, and somehow found my way back to the main trail as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the trees. I reached my truck as the sun painted the morning sky in pale pinks and golds, my breath coming in ragged gasps, hands bleeding from brambles, and my heart racing with terror that would take years to fully subside. My friends were never found, despite extensive searches by local authorities and volunteers. Their cars were discovered at the trailhead, but no trace of them was ever located in the hollow itself. Despite my escape, the hollow song has never truly left me. It haunts my dreams and sometimes wakes me in the dead of night. A faint melody riding the wind like a ghostly reminder that some places never fully release their prisoners. I moved away from Beckley after that summer, unable to live so close to Whispering Hollow. But distance has not provided the peace I sought. For years since, I have kept the secret of what really happened that night, telling only carefully edited versions to those few people I trusted enough to share even part of the truth. The reality of that night is darker than any mountain legend. The singing is not just a haunting echo of the past, but a living curse that waits patiently, ever hungry, ready to welcome anyone foolish enough to enter the hollow after dark. Now, when I hear faint music on quiet summer evenings or catch the slightest melody on an evening breeze, I know the hollow is calling again, waiting for its next visitors. And I know deep in my bones that someday it will come for me again. Because some songs are written in blood and sung with voices that will never be silenced. The mountains keep their promises, both good and ill. And Whispering Hollow has been singing the same song for more than a century, waiting patiently for those who refuse to listen to the warnings passed down through generations of mountain wisdom. My name is Laura, and ever since I was a kid, the Appalachian Mountains have been a second home to me. My parents owned a stretch of wooded land tucked into the hills of West Virginia, a place our family had kept for generations. Summers there were sacred. My cousins and I grew up learning the old ways, catching trout in icy creeks, recognizing which berries were safe, and listening to the unspoken rules of the woods that my grandfather always insisted were as important as any map or compass. I thought I knew those mountains better than anywhere else on earth. I thought I understood them. Last fall proved how wrong I was. It was early September when I decided to bring my daughter, Hannah, along for a weekend camping trip. She was 15, glued to her phone most days, and far from interested in leaving behind her friends and Wi-Fi. But I wanted her to feel what I had felt all my life, the quiet pull of the mountains, the way they demanded respect but offered peace in return. She protested at first, rolling her eyes at the idea of roughing it, but eventually agreed. We packed light, a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, some food, and the same battered old camp stove I'd been using since college. The drive up the winding road felt like stepping back in time. Paved asphalt turned to gravel, gravel to a rutted dirt track that seemed more memory than road. Cell service vanished somewhere along the way, and Hannah complained about the dead zone, but I noticed her mood shift as the air grew cooler and the forest thickened around us. By the time we reached the old clearing, my grandfather's favorite spot, shaded by towering oaks and maples, her irritation had softened into reluctant curiosity. We worked together to set up camp. I showed her the same tricks my father had once shown me. How to angle the stakes so the tent would hold in mountain winds. How to tie food up high so Bachan ears couldn't get at it. Hannah listened more closely than I expected, asking a few questions, even laughing when I teased her about her sloppy knots. By dusk, we had a tidy little setup and a fire crackling in the ring of stones I'd used since childhood. The sky turned purple behind the tree line, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. That first night was easy, almost idyllic. We roasted hot dogs, shared stories, and stared up through gaps in the canopy at a scatter of stars you just can't see from town. Hannah even admitted she liked the quiet. Before we went to bed, I carefully banked the fire like my grandfather had taught me, leaving a solid bed of coals to keep animals wary and to make it easier to restart in the morning. With the fire glowing low, We crawled into our tent and fell asleep to the sound of owls calling from the valley. I woke before dawn, eager to make coffee. But when I unzipped the tent, the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. The fire wasn't coals. It was still burning bright, just as it had been 6 hours earlier. The logs were unblackened, whole, and stacked exactly as I remembered. The flames danced steadily, unchanged, as though time hadn't touched them. For a long moment I just stared, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd underestimated how slow the wood burned. Maybe the air was unusually still. But deep inside, something old and instinctive in me recoiled. Hannah stirred and joined me, yawning. She noticed the fire and grinned. "Nice job, Mom. You really kept it going all night." I nodded but didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to correct her. Instead, I made coffee, staring at the flames that never flickered no matter how the morning breeze shifted. We spent that day exploring. I showed her the massive trees that had escaped the logging boom, their trunks scarred but alive. We followed deer paths through meadows still climb, to late wildflowers. Hannah grew quiet, not with boredom, but with wonder. Yet through it all I felt watched. Not the way you feel when wildlife eyes you from the brush. This was heavier, more deliberate, like the forest itself was aware of us. The usual soundtrack of birds and insects seemed hushed. That night, the fire continued its strange behavior. We added wood, but the flames never swelled or shrank. They simply burned, perfectly even, as though fueled by something other than the logs we fed it. Hannah sat reading a paperback by the light, content, while I found myself caught in a trance, staring at that unnatural steadiness. Sometime around midnight, I woke to voices, low, conversational, drifting just outside the tent. My blood ran cold. At first I thought maybe other campers had wandered into our clearing, but the tone was wrong. The cadence was almost human, but off, like people imitating speech without understanding it. My pulse hammered as I nudged Hannah awake. She froze, wide-eyed, listening. The murmurs grew clearer, shifting between laughter and hushed urgency. Yet when I strained to catch actual words, they dissolved into nonsense, slipping away like fragments of a dream. Most disturbing of all, their shadows never crossed our tent walls, despite the fire still blazing just a few feet away. We lay rigid, listening for what felt like hours. When dawn broke, I forced myself to step outside. The fire still burned unchanged, but the clearing was no longer how we'd left it. The ground around the fire was churned with footprints, too many, too deep, oddly shaped. Our camp chairs, once side by side, were arranged in a perfect circle around the flames. And there were offerings. Bundles of flowers braided into strange knots, smooth stones stacked into towers, strips of bark etched with symbols I didn't recognize. Hannah begged to leave. I didn't argue. As we tore down camp, my hands shook. Then I saw something that nearly made me collapse. The fire ring itself had unged. What had once been a rough circle of stones was now a precise, elaborate pattern. The rocks were mortared with some kind of clay, fused into a design far too intricate to have been done overnight. We loaded the truck in silence and drove down the mountain as fast as the dirt road allowed. But as we rounded a bend, I made the mistake of glancing back. Through the trees, the fire was still burning, and shadowed figures stood around it, unmoving. One of them raised an arm in what might have been a wave. I hit the gas harder, gravel spitting under the tires until the forest swallowed the clearing from view. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. For the first time, I dug into the history of that land. What I found explained some things, and made others worse. Long before my family owned it, the clearing had been a Cherokee site. They believed the spring nearby was sacred, and that a ceremonial fire there was never meant to die. Later, during the Civil War, deserters from both sides had used the spot as a hideout. Local folklore was filled with stories of people disappearing in those woods, or returning changed, whispering about fires that burned forever. Hannah hasn't camped since. She refuses even to talk about it. I can't blame her. I still own the land, but I'll never go back. Some fires aren't meant to be touched, and some traditions are too dangerous to continue. Yet on certain nights, when the wind drifts down from the hills, I swear I catch the faint scent of smoke, and sometimes if I listen too closely, I almost hear voices in the crackle of flames, patient, waiting, and far older than any of us. My name is Jake Rodriguez, and I am from Hazard, Kentucky. I have always felt a strange pull toward the old abandoned coal mines scattered across the Appalachian Mountains, ghostly remnants of an industry that once fueled much of America. From a young age, I was fascinated not only by their history, but also by the dark, hidden tunnels underneath those hills. The lure was magnetic, almost supernatural. My friends and I formed a group we called the Kentucky Cave Crawlers, and we were obsessed with exploring every forgotten cave, every collapsed shaft, and every hidden crevice we could find from here to Virginia. We thought we knew those woods and underground labyrinths like the back of our hands until the night we found something that forced us to question everything we believed about what lurks beneath the surface of our mountains. It was the spring of 2015. The entire region was stirring to life after a brutal winter that had kept us cooped up for months. Trees began blossoming new leaves, streams flooded with melting snow, and the mountain air still carried that biting cold after sunset that reminded you winter had not completely loosened its grip. Our group consisted of me, Tom, Eric, Maria, and Sean. 5 reckless 20-somethings who had been tracking down a new exploration site for weeks. We pored over historic mining records at the county courthouse, searched obscure online forums where old-timers shared forgotten stories and hand-drawn maps, and even interviewed a few elderly locals who still remembered the glory days of coal mining in eastern Kentucky. That is how we stumbled upon references to the Black Hollow Pit, a mine that had been officially closed in the mid-1960s, but had since been shrouded in mystery. The records were incomplete, but what we could piece together painted a disturbing picture. The mine had been shut down abruptly after a series of accidents and unexplained disappearances that the mining company had tried to cover up. Workers reported strange sounds echoing from the deeper tunnels, equipment that moved on its own, and an eerie presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. The final incident involved an entire shift of 12 miners who had gone missing without a trace. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The evening we arrived at Black Hollow, the sun was dipping below the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like dying embers scattered across the heavens. We parked our trucks at the edge of the hollow and shouldered our backpacks loaded down with flashlights, ropes, first aid kits, and enough supplies for what we hoped would be a thorough exploration. The entrance to the mine yawned before us like a hungry mouth, framed by the skeletal remains of rusted machinery and weathered wooden structures that had been slowly decomposing for half a century. Warning signs, their paint faded and text barely legible, were scattered around the perimeter like forgotten prayers. The air near the entrance was different, heavier somehow, charged with something indefinable that made the hair on our arms stand up. It smelled of dampness and decay. But underneath those familiar cave scents was something else, something organic and wrong that none of us could identify. Despite our unease, curiosity won out over caution, and we crossed the threshold into the darkness. Our flashlight beams cut through the thick blackness that seemed to swallow light itself. The tunnel walls pressed close around us, rough-hewn stone and timber supports that groaned ominously under the weight of decades of neglect. With each step, we stirred up clouds of dust and debris that had been undisturbed for years, creating a choking atmosphere that forced us to cover our faces with bandana. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water falling from unseen heights and the echo of our own footsteps. We spoke in hushed tones, acutely aware of how unstable this place might be and how a single loud noise could potentially trigger a collapse. As we pushed deeper into the mine, the temperature dropped noticeably, and we found ourselves pulling on extra layers despite having been comfortable outside. Tom, who always carried the specialized equipment for our expeditions, had brought along a heavy-duty grappling hook attached to mountaineering rope, planning to explore any vertical shafts that we might encounter. After what felt like hours of walking through winding passages and navigating around cave-ins, we reached what appeared to be the main shaft, a perfectly circular abyss that plunged straight down into absolute darkness. The engineering was impressive. Whoever had carved this shaft had done so with precision and skill that spoke to the serious mining operation this had once been. Tom secured his rope to a solid anchor point and carefully lowered the grappling hook into the void, hoping to find a ledge or side tunnel somewhere below that we could explore. But no matter how much rope he fed into the shaft, the hook never caught on anything. We began to wonder just how deep this thing went and what secrets might be hidden in its depths. That was when the sounds started. At first they were so faint we thought we might be imagining them. Soft noises that could have been wind moving through the tunnels or the settling of old timbers. But gradually they became more distinct and infinitely more disturbing. We began hearing what sounded like breathing, rhythmic and controlled, as though something large was sleeping just beyond the range of our lights. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, the voices echoed up from the depths of the sea, halved and drifted through the side passages, calling our names with perfect pronunciation and inflection. They spoke in familiar tones, mimicking people we knew, our parents, siblings, childhood friends, and sharing secrets that only we should have known. The voices pleaded for help, promised safety, and begged us to come closer, to help them find their way out of the darkness. Despite every instinct screaming at us to run, curiosity proved stronger than caution. We found ourselves drawn to a narrow side passage that had not been marked on any of the old mining maps we had studied. The walls of this tunnel were different from the others we had explored. They seemed to shimmer in our flashlight beams, covered with a slick, tar-like substance that was oily to the touch and gave off a pungent odor that made our eyes water. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, almost difficult to breathe, and from somewhere deep in the passage came a low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate through the solid rock. We should have turned back then. Every survival instinct we possessed was screaming warnings, but something compelled us forward, a force that felt almost hypnotic, drawing us deeper into the bowels of the mountain despite our growing terror. That is when we encountered the thing. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form, a grotesque amalgamation of darkness and stone that defied every natural law we understood. The creature was constantly shifting and changing, its form pulsating like molten rock barely contained by some invisible force. Parts of it seemed solid one moment and vapor the next, as though it existed in multiple states of matter simultaneously. Its eyes were the worst part, blazing red coals that burned with an otherworldly intelligence and malevolence that seemed to pierce straight through to our souls. But what truly unnerved us was its voice. The thing could perfectly mimic any sound it had ever heard. And as we stood frozen in terror, it began calling to us in the voices of our loved ones. It spoke with Tom's mother's worried tone, asking why he had not called home in weeks. It used Maria's voice to beg Sean for help, claiming to be lost and afraid. Most disturbing of all, it began revealing intimate details about our lives, childhood memories, private conversations, secrets we had never shared with anyone. The realization hit us like a physical blow. This thing had been listening, learning, collecting the voices and memories of everyone who had ever entered these tunnels. The missing miners, the disappeared explorers, the workers who had vanished without a trace. They were all here in some sense, trapped within this creature's consciousness and being used as bait for the next victims. Panic erupted among our group. Eric, who had been standing closest to the thing, suddenly screamed and stumbled backward. But something grabbed him from the shadows, invisible hands that dragged him into the darkness despite his desperate struggles. His cries for help echoed through the tunnels for what seemed like an eternity before being cut off with terrifying abruptness. One by one, my friends vanished into the blackness. Tom disappeared while trying to help Eric, yanked into a side passage by unseen forces. Maria's flashlight went out suddenly, and when we tried to find her in the darkness, she was simply gone, as though she had never existed at all. Sean lasted the longest, staying close to me as we tried to find our way back to the main tunnel. But even he eventually succumbed to the thing's call, walking will. Ingley toward the creature despite my desperate pleas for him to stop. I was left alone in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the thing's whispers and promises. It spoke to me in the voices of everyone I had ever loved, telling me that joining my friends would end my loneliness forever, that I could be part of something greater than myself, that the pain of living would finally stop if I just took a few more steps forward. In that moment of absolute terror and despair, something inside me snapped back to reality. Perhaps it was pure survival instinct, or maybe some deeply buried memory of my grandmother's warnings about the dangers that lurked in the old mines. But I suddenly understood that I had to run, or I would never see daylight again. I turned and fled through the twisting corridors, stumbling over debris and crashing into walls as my flashlight flickered and dimmed. Behind me, the thing's voice followed, no longer sweet and coaxing, but filled with rage and hunger, promising terrible fates if I did not return to join my friends in the eternal darkness. My lungs burned and my legs cramped, but I kept running through passages that seemed to shift and change around me as though the mine itself was trying to prevent my escape. Just when I thought I would collapse from exhaustion, when my flashlight finally died and left me in complete blackness, I saw a faint glow ahead. The blessed light of dawn creeping through the mine entrance. I burst from the tunnel into the early morning air and collapsed among the rusted machinery and scattered debris, gasping and shaking as the horror of what I had experienced slowly sank in. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting everything in soft pastels that seemed impossibly beautiful after the nightmare I had endured. But even in the safety of daylight, I could still hear faint echoes of the thing's voice calling from the depths, promising that it would be waiting whenever I chose to return. Since that night, my life has never been the same. The nightmares are constant and vivid, filled with visions of my friends being slowly consumed by the creature, their voices added to its collection of lures for future victims. I hear whispers in every shadow, see movement in every dark corner, and live with the constant fear that the thing might somehow follow me into the world above. I have tried to warn others about what lurks in the black hollow pit, but most people dismiss my story as trauma-induced delusions or an elaborate hoax. The mine has been officially sealed now, surrounded by new warning fences and signs. But I know that such measures are ultimately meaningless. The thing has been waiting in those tunnels for decades, possibly centuries, and a few barriers will not stop the curious or the foolhardy from finding their way inside. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows just right through the mountains, I swear I can still hear its voice carried on the air, calling my name, promising reunion with my lost friends, and reminding me that it knows where I live. The Black Hollow Pit is no ordinary abandoned mine. It conceals something ancient and predatory, something that feeds on human souls and grows stronger with each victim it claims. And deep in my heart, I know that someday, despite all my efforts to resist, I will return to those tunnels. The thing is patient, and its call grows stronger with each passing year, wearing down my resistance like water slowly eroding stone. When that day comes, when I finally walk back into the darkness to join my friends, there will be no one left to tell this story or warn the next group of explorers who stumble upon the Black Hollow Pit. The mountains keep their secrets, and some doors once opened can never be closed again. My name is Elias, and I've spent the better part of my adult life exploring the forgotten corners of Appalachia. There's a strange poetry in abandoned structures, the way they decay while still whispering stories of lives that once thrived within them. families who carved out existence in these unforgiving mountains, only to surrender eventually to isolation, disease, or misfortune. I document these forgotten homesteads with my camera, trying to preserve some record of the people who called these wild places home. Most cabins I encounter are harmless relics, rotting timber, squeaky floors, and the occasional snake. But there was one cabin, deep in a hollow that locals refused to name, that taught me that some places are abandoned for reasons far older and darker than convenience or poverty. It was late October when I first heard of the structure from an old-timer named Ezra who ran the only general store in his valley. He spoke of it reluctantly, like he'd breathed the name aloud only to ward off some unseen listener. According to Ezra, the cabin had been built in the 1800s by a family named Miller, who had pushed further into the mountains than anyone dared. They were self-sufficient, raising crops, hunting, forging tools, rarely contacting the outside world. Then, around 1920, they simply vanished. The cabin remained, fully furnished, untouched, as though they had stepped out for a single errand and never returned. Ezra's warning lingered in my mind. Over the years, he said, many had tried to claim the property or strip materials from it, but all left hastily, refusing to discuss what they'd encountered. Hunters avoided the hollow, whispering that the wildlife there behaved differently, unnaturally. Even the hardiest mountain men, those who had spent their lives amid these peaks, would speak of Miller's Hollow only in hushed tones, crossing themselves if the subject arose. I spent weeks researching the location, poring over old survey maps, cross-referencing them with modern topography. The hollow was accessible only by miles of unmarked wilderness, tangled brush, deer paths, creek crossings that would flood in rain. I planned for a 3-day expedition, packing enough provisions in case I became lost or decided to document the site thoroughly. The hike in was more grueling than I anticipated. The mountains seemed to resist my progress, trails fading without warning, streams forcing detours through thickets. My GPS faltered the deeper I went, and I relied on old-fashioned compass work and landmark recognition, skills my grandfather had taught me on childhood camping trips. Hours passed until the dense forest suddenly gave way to a narrow valley. The hollow opened before me, a natural amphitheater cradled by steep ridges. A crystal-clear stream ran through its center, reflecting the sun in tiny golden flashes. The ground was unexpectedly level, a rare feature in these mountains, and perhaps the reason the Millers had chosen this spot. Ancient oaks and chestnuts arched overhead, their canopy turning the afternoon light into shafts that illuminated the valley like a cathedral. At the far end, the cabin sat quietly, as if waiting. Even from a distance, it was remarkable. The logs, weathered but intact, showed the hand of skilled builders. The stone chimney rose straight and unyielding. A porch stretched across the front, and several outbuildings suggested a once thriving homestead. But it wasn't just the structure that drew my attention. It was the silence. These mountains are never truly quiet. There is always the wind rustling through trees, the call of a distant bird, the scuttle of small animals. Miller's Hollow, however, seemed to swallow sound itself. My footsteps on the fallen leaves felt amplified, almost intrusive. The cabin door was closed but unlatched. I hesitated, a strange unease settling in my chest. I called out, a habit from years exploring abandoned buildings, sometimes inhabited by transients or wild animals. No reply came, only a hollow echo, as if the valley itself had swallowed my voice. Inside, the cabin was a perfect time capsule. Furniture sat exactly as the Millers had left it over a century ago. A wooden table dominated the main room, tin plates and cups arranged as if a family had paused mid-meal. Shelves lined with jars of preserves, hand-carved bowls and leather-bound books, somehow resisting decay. And yet, there was no dust. The floors gleamed, the windows were clear, and even the bedding in the back room appeared fresh, untouched. It was spotless, impossibly so. I began photographing the interior meticulously, noting every item, every arrangement. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The Millers were clearly skilled, meticulous in every detail. But as I moved from room to room, a prickling sensation crept across my skin. I felt watched, evaluated by eyes unseen. By late afternoon, the feeling intensified. Shadows pooled in corners, and the temperature dropped despite the mild October air. Every movement I thought I saw in my peripheral vision vanished when I turned to look. In the back bedroom, I discovered a family Bible, open to handwritten entries detailing births, deaths, and marriages. The last entry was dated October 31st, 1920, scrawled in a hand trembling with either fear or age. They came for us in the night. May God forgive what we must do to keep them from following. Below, in a different hand, the door must remain closed. The watching must continue. I photographed the page, but when I checked my camera, the image showed only blank pages. I tried again. Same result. My hand shook as realization settled in. This place actively resisted BIs, I'm documented. Darkness fell quickly, enveloping the valley. I had planned to camp nearby, but the oppressive atmosphere made staying impossible. As I gathered my gear, voices drifted from the front room, low, conversational, discussing matters I could not understand. The sounds seemed to float, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as though emanating from underground. Their rhythm and intonation were wrong, unnervingly so, not entirely human. I abandoned caution. All I wanted was to escape, but the cabin door refused to open. The latch, which had lifted effortlessly before, now seemed fused to the wood. Voices swelled, footsteps echoed across floors, furniture creaked and scraped. Doors opened and closed elsewhere in the cabin, yet when I looked, everything was exactly as I had left it, perfectly pristine, unnervingly so. Desperation surged. I threw my full weight against the door. It gave way suddenly, and I tumbled onto the porch. I ran without looking back, flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness. Branches tore at my clothes, roots tripped me. Twice I fell, scraping hands and knees, but I did not stop until I reached my truck, parked on the last accessible road. Days later, I developed the photographs. Most came out normally, showing the cabin in crisp detail, but some revealed things I had not seen. Shadowy figures in doorways, faces peering through windows. One image was especially chilling, a family, gathered around the table, translucent, staring at the camera with expressions of infinite sadness. I never returned to Miller's Hollow. I have never shared its location with other explorers or historians. Some places exist to remain undisturbed, protected by forces we do not understand. The Millers may be gone, but their home is maintained, patiently, by something beyond human comprehension. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes the wisest see. Choice is to leave sleeping mysteries undisturbed in their hidden hollows. My name is Autumn Blackwood, and I am a nature photographer from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I have spent the last 12 years capturing the wild beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains, documenting everything from the delicate wildflowers that bloom in hidden meadows to the majestic elk that roam the high country. Photography has always been more than just my profession. It is my passion, my escape, and my way of connecting with the ancient spirits that dwell in these mountains. I came to the Smokies in late October of 2018 to photograph the fall colors, armed with nothing but my camera equipment and a lifetime of hiking experience that I thought would keep me safe from anything the wilderness could throw at me. The area I had chosen for this particular shoot was a remote section of the Appalachian Trail that winds through some of the most pristine wilderness left in Tennessee. It was a place few tourists ever ventured, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through dense forest and steep terrain that discouraged all but the most dedicated hikers. I had discovered this location the previous spring while chasing a rare species of wildflower, and the memory of its untouched beauty had drawn me back with the promise of capturing the perfect autumn landscape. I set out before dawn on what promised to be a perfect October day. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures with just enough morning mist to add drama to my photographs. I packed light but carefully. My professional camera gear, extra batteries, enough food and water for a full day in the backcountry, and the usual safety equipment that any experienced hiker carries into the wilderness. The trail was familiar to me, and I expected to reach my destination by mid-morning when the light would be perfect for the shots I had planned. The hike started exactly as I had anticipated. The forest was alive wet. The colors of autumn, brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow with an inner fire, punctuated by the deep greens of the evergreens that gave the Smoky Mountains their name. My camera clicked constantly as I documented the journey, capturing the interplay of light and shadow that filtered through the canopy above. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of decomposing leaves and that distinctive mountain freshness that always cleared my mind and lifted my spirits. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning when I first noticed the fog. At first, it seemed perfectly natural, a thin mist rising from the valleys below as the morning sun warmed the cool air. The Smokies are famous for their fog after all, and I had photographed similar phenomena hundreds of times before. But as I continued hiking, I began to realize that this fog was different. Instead of dissipating as the day warmed, it seemed to be growing thicker and more concentrated, forming a solid wall of white that stretched across the valley like a living thing. What struck me as unusual was how localized the fog appeared to be. While the area directly in front of me was shrouded in an impenetrable mist, the sky above remained perfectly clear, and I could see for miles in every other direction. It was as though someone had drawn a precise boundary around a specific section of the mountains, filling only that area with dense fog while leaving everything else untouched. My photographer's instincts kicked in immediately. This was exactly the kind of unique natural phenomenon that could result in truly spectacular images, the kind that might grace the cover of National Geographic or win awards at prestigious photography competitions. I adjusted my route to get closer to the fog bank, moving off the main trail and into the trackless wilderness that I knew so well. As I approached the edge of the mist, I was struck by how perfectly defined it was. There was no gradual transition from clear air to fog. Instead, there was a sharp demarcation line where the visibility dropped from miles to mere feet in the space of a single step. The temperature differential was immediately noticeable as well. The moment I entered the fog, the air became noticeably colder and more humid, clinging to my skin like a damp blanket. I spent the next hour working the edges of the fog bank, capturing images of the ghostly trees that appeared and disappeared in the swirling mist, the way the fog seemed to move with purpose rather than simply drifting on air currents. My camera captured things my eyes missed, strange shapes that seemed almost human, moving through the mist with deliberate intent, shadows that did not correspond to any visible objects. It was when I stopped to change lenses that I realized the fog was following me. I had moved perhaps half a mile along the ridge, staying just outside the fog bank to maintain visibility while I worked. But when I looked back at the path I had traveled, I saw that the fog had shifted position, maintaining the same relative distance from me, regardless of which direction I moved. When I walked north, the fog moved north. When I turned south, it adjusted its position accordingly. This was not the behavior of any natural weather phenomenon I had ever encountered. Intrigued, rather than alarmed, I still thought I was witnessing some unusual but explainable meteorological event. I decided to test my theory more systematically. I marked my current position with a small cairn of stones and then deliberately walked a quarter mile in each direction, documenting the fog's response with my camera. The results were undeniable. The fog was actively tracking my movements, maintaining a consistent distance of approximately 50 yards regardless of terrain or wind conditions. That was when I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. I had been hiking these mountains for over a decade, and I had never encountered anything like this before. Fog simply does not behave this way under normal circumstances. Weather systems are governed by predictable physical laws, temperature differentials, barometric pressure, wind patterns. But this fog seemed to operate according to rules I did not understand, responding to my presence in ways that defied everything I knew about meteorology. As the afternoon wore on, my unease deepened into genuine concern. The fog had not only continued to follow me, but had begun to behave more aggressively. Several times I found myself inadvertently entering the mist when the boundary shifted suddenly, enveloping me in a disorienting whiteout that made navigation impossible. During these brief encounters, I experienced strange sensations. The feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, whispers that might have been wind but sounded disturbingly like human voices, and shadows moving just beyond the edge of visibility. Most disturbing of all was what happened to my sense of time and direction within the fog. On multiple occasions, I would enter the mist for what felt like only a few minutes, only to emerge and discover that hours had passed, and I was miles from where I thought I should be. My GPS became unreliable within the fog, displaying impossible coordinates or simply losing signal altogether. My compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. It was during one of these disorienting episodes that I encountered the figures. I had been engulfed by the fog for what felt like an eternity, stumbling blindly through the mist while trying to find my way back to familiar terrain. The visibility was down to perhaps 3 feet, and every direction looked identical, an endless maze of ghostly trees and swirling white vapor. My calls for help were absorbed by the fog without even an echo, as though the mist itself was consuming sound. That was when I saw them moving through the fog ahead of me, human-shaped silhouettes that appeared and disappeared like phantoms. At first, I thought they might be other hikers who had become lost in the same phenomenon I was experiencing, and I called out to them desperately, hoping they might be able to help me navigate out of this supernatural labyrinth. But as I got closer, I realized that these figures were not entirely human. They moved with a strange gliding motion that seemed to defy gravity, their feet never quite touching the ground. Their proportions were subtly wrong. Arms that were too long, heads that were too large, limbs that bent in directions that human joints should not allow. And their faces, when I caught glimpses of them through the swirling mist, were blank spaces where features should have been, smooth and featureless, like mannequins that had never been properly finished. The figures seemed aware of my presence, but showed no interest in helping me. Instead, they appeared to be herding me, moving in coordinated patterns that gradually forced me deeper into the fog, away from the safety of clear air and familiar landmarks. When I tried to move in one direction, they would appear to block my path. When I turned to go another way, more figures would materialize to guide me along the route they wanted me to take. Panic finally overcame my fascination with this impossible phenomenon. I realized that I was not simply observing a strange weather event. I was being hunted by something that used the fog as both camouflage and weapon, something that had possibly been responsible for the unexplained disappearances that occasionally plagued these mountains. Stories I had dismissed as local folklore suddenly took on terrifying new significance. Hikers who had vanished without a trace, search parties that found no evidence despite extensive efforts, the whispered warnings about certain areas of the mountains that should be avoided during times of heavy fog. Drawing on every ounce of my wilderness survival training, I forced myself to stop panicking and think rationally about my situation. The fog might be supernatural, but I was still in physical terrain that followed natural laws. I still had my compass, even if it was spinning wildly, and I still had a general sense of the topography, even if my GPS was failing. Most importantly, I still had my camera, which had been faithfully documenting everything I had experienced. I began taking photographs rapidly, using the camera's flash to illuminate the fog around me in brief, brilliant bursts. The strobing light seemed to disorient the figures that had been hurting me, causing them to retreat temporarily into the deeper mist. More importantly, the flash revealed details about my surroundings that were invisible to the naked eye, the actual positions of trees and rocks, the slope of the terrain, and most critically, a faint game trail that led uphill toward what I hoped would be clear air. Using the camera flash as my guide, I fought my way through the fog toward higher ground. The figures followed, their movements becoming more frantic and aggressive as they realized I was escaping their trap. At times, I felt cold hands grasping at my backpack and clothing, trying to pull me back into the depths of the mist. But each time, another burst of light from my camera would force them to retreat, giving me precious moments to continue my desperate ascent. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, time had no meaning within the fog. I finally broke through the upper boundary of the mist and collapsed on solid ground under clear blue skies. The fog lay below me like a vast white ocean, its surface smooth and untroubled, showing no sign of the nightmare I had just endured. The figures were nowhere to be seen, and the oppressive sense of being watched had lifted like a weight removed from my shoulders. I did not stop to rest or recover. Despite my exhaustion and disorientation, I immediately began hiking toward the nearest marked trail, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the supernatural fog bank. It was not until I reached the safety of the main Appalachian Trail with other hikers visible in both directions that I finally allowed myself to stop and process what had happened. When I reviewed the photographs from that day, I discovered that my camera had captured far more than I had consciously observed. The images showed the fog-shrouded figures in terrifying detail, their impossible anatomy, their predatory movements, and most disturbing of all, their featureless faces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But most importantly, the photographs provided proof that what I had experienced was not hallucination or altitude sickness, but a genuine encounter with something that defied natural explanation. Since that day, I have never returned to that remote section of the Smokies, despite the fact that it remains one of the most photogenic locations I have ever discovered. The fog appears occasionally in weather reports from that area, described by meteorologists as an unusual localized phenomenon that they cannot fully explain. Hikers still go missing in that region with disturbing regularity, their disappearances attributed to the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. But I know the truth about what lurks in that supernatural mist. The fog that follows is not a weather pattern. It is a hunter, patient and intelligent, that uses the natural beauty of the mountains to lure its prey into a trap from which few ever return. And sometimes, on misty October mornings when the conditions are just right, I can still see it from my home in Gatlinburg, a small patch of fog that moves against the wind, searching the ridgelines for its next victim. The mountains keep their secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to remain hidden. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Smokies and encounter fog that behaves in ways that fog should not behave, do not let curiosity override your survival instincts. Turn around immediately and leave the area as quickly as possible. Some photographs are not worth the price they demand, and some stories are better left untold, because the fog that follows is still out there, waiting patiently for the next photographer or hiker who thinks they can capture its mysteries without becoming part of them forever. My name is Elysia, and for the past 12 years, I've been a volunteer with the search and rescue team, covering the remote reaches of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky. Our group is small but skilled, people who know these hills intimately, who understand the hidden dangers and strange beauty of the ancient mountains. Most of the time, our work is straightforward. A hiker lost, a hunter who failed to return, a child who wandered too far from a family campsite. Our rescues end with hugs, tears of relief, and stories that become local legends. But one winter, 3 years ago, changed how I view these mountains and the secrets they keep. It began on a December morning, the first heavy snowfall blanketing the valleys and ridges. The call came from Maren Wexler, a local woman whose family had lived on the eastern slopes of the mountains for generations. Her granddaughter, Ira, 16 years old, had left on a short hike to photograph the early snowfall and never returned. Ira was an experienced hiker, born and raised in these woods, familiar with trails and hidden paths, but she had been gone for over 18 hours and the storm was intensifying. We assembled at first light at the Wexler farmhouse, a weathered structure perched in a narrow valley. Marin's hands shook as she poured coffee into thermoses, spreading out a hand-drawn map showing Era's intended route. The girl had planned to follow an old logging road to a scenic overlook, take photographs, and return before dark, a hike she had done dozens of times without issue. Our team that day was 6 strong. Me, Orrin Calloway, a veteran rescuer with 20 years of experience, Sable Harrington, who handled our trained bloodhound, Ashen, and 3 newer volunteers eager to prove themselves in the mountain's harsh conditions. We divided into pairs, each covering different sections of Era's route while maintaining radio contact. I paired with Orrin, taking the most direct path to the overlook. The snow fell thickly, already covering any tracks that might indicate Era's path. Temperatures hovered near 20 degrees, and gusts of wind swept down the valley, turning the cold into a biting, almost tangible presence. The logging road was surprisingly intact, wide enough for an ATV, but as we climbed, the landscape began to feel wrong. There were no animal tracks, no distant bird calls, no trace of the small mammals that usually make their presence known in winter. The forest itself seemed silent, watching. As we ascended, the wind carried faint sounds, half whispers, almost like voices, but not human. I dismissed it at first, blaming nerves and exhaustion, but the unease settled in my chest like ice. 2 hours in, we reached the overlook. The scenic area, normally bustling with winter birds and squirrels, was utterly deserted. Snow covered every inch, and there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. Orrin radioed the other teams. I expanded the search pattern, scanning for subtle signs. Broken branches, disturbed snow, anything to indicate which direction Era might have gone. That's when I noticed the trees. Among the usual oaks and maples, there were enormous pines and twisted deciduous trees, their bark scarred in intricate patterns I had never seen. Some still held onto their leaves despite the snow. From their branches came soft, discordant murmurs, neither human nor animal. I shivered, realizing that even experienced mountain guides are not immune to fear in these ancient woods. Meanwhile, Sable's radio crackled with urgent tones. Ashen, her bloodhound, had picked up a trail leading away from the main road, deeper into the mountains toward a place the locals call Widow's Spine, a narrow ridge connecting several peaks. The dog hesitated, reluctant to follow, growling softly, a behavior highly unusual for an experienced tracker. Orrin and I joined Sable's team at the trailhead. The path was barely visible under the snow, more a game trail than a human route. Yet if Era had gone this way, we had no choice but to follow. We roped ourselves together for safety, navigating loose rocks and steep drop-offs hidden beneath the snow. The weather worsened at a speed no forecast could predict. The wind shrieked through the peaks, snow fell in blinding sheets, and the ridge seemed to stretch endlessly, unfamiliar despite maps and previous hikes. The trail itself felt unstable, almost alive, twisting in ways that defied memory and logic. Every step I took, the snow seemed to swallow me, and a whispering undertone followed me. Soft, unintelligible, yet demanding attention. After what felt like hours, Orrin spotted it. A faint glow through the swirling snow. A small structure nestled against the cliff face. An old mining cabin, its windows glowing warmly, smoke curling from the chimney. My heart leaped with relief. Perhaps Era had taken shelter here. We approached cautiously, calling out, expecting to see a frightened teenager. The door swung open before we reached it. And there he was, an elderly man, dressed in clothes that seemed centuries old. He greeted us warmly, his voice carrying the cadence of the mountain's oldest folk. Era sat by the fireplace wrapped in blankets, sipping a steaming cup of tea. Relief surged through me, yet I felt the first stirrings of unease. The girl's eyes were vacant, distant, her movements slow, almost dreamlike. The old D-man explained that she had arrived exhausted the previous evening. He had been caring for her, waiting for help to arrive. His stories were rich with detail, history, and dates. Yet as he spoke, inconsistencies surfaced, names and events that would have made him impossibly old. The radios were dead. No static, no interference, just silence. It was as if the cabin existed outside the normal bounds of our world. Oren and I exchanged uneasy glances. I examined Era gently. She responded to questions with nods or shakes of her head, yet could not speak. Hypothermia or injury were absent. She had spent the night in warmth and comfort. Too warm, too convenient. The storm outside worsened. Every instinct screamed at me that this place was wrong, that the old man was no ordinary caretaker. When I suggested moving Era to higher ground for radio contact, his demeanor shifted. For a fleeting moment, his expression held something primal. Hunger, or perhaps patience. We gathered Era quickly, supporting her between us as we left the cabin. The moment we stepped into the snowstorm, she seemed to awaken, looking around as if emerging from a dream. She could not explain how she had arrived at the cabin, only that she was terrified of returning. The descent along Widow's Spine was grueling. Snow and wind made navigation perilous, but Era gradually regained awareness, able to walk and help find routes. By the time we reached the logging road, she was coherent, frightened, but alive. When we returned to the Wexler farmhouse, 12 hours after locating Era, Marin's tears of relief and gratitude were overwhelming. Yet when I attempted to report the cabin's existence, the GPS and radio logs showed only forest, no buildings, no trails, no mining activity. Era never regained memory of the missing hours. Her medical check showed no exposure or injury, no sign of hardship. It was as if the mountains had sheltered her from the storm, yet in a place that did not exist. I have returned to Widow's Spine several times since, always in fair weather and never alone. I have never seen the cabin or the old man again. Yet on certain winter nights when the snow falls heavily and the wind howls through the peaks, I swear I see a faint glow deep in the mountains, warm and patient, waiting for the next lost traveler. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they share them, for a price that not everyone survives to tell. Era was lucky. Not every lost soul finds such sanctuary, and not every cabin offers simple refuge from the storm. My name is Benjamin O'Sullivan, but everyone has always called me Benny. I am from Charleston, West Virginia, and this is a story I have kept buried for 37 years. A story about 3 months of my childhood that I had convinced myself were nothing more than an overactive imagination until recent events forced me to confront the truth. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a remote cabin on Pine Ridge, deep in the mountains of West Virginia. For those 3 months during the summer of 1987, I played with children who should never have existed, and the memories of that time have haunted me ever since. My parents, both city people who had grown tired of the hustle and bustle of Charleston, decided that summer to rent a cabin far from civilization. They spoke of wanting to reconnect with nature, to give their children a taste of the simple mountain life they themselves had never experienced. The cabin they found was isolated even by Appalachian standards. A 2-room log structure built sometime in the early 1900s, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. Pine Ridge had once been home to a thriving mining community. The mountains were honeycombed with coal shafts and the remnants of company housing. But by the 1980s, nothing remained except foundations overgrown with weeds and rusted machinery slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and the silence of the mountains was broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a mountain bird. For the first week, I was miserable. An 8-year-old boy accustomed to sidewalks and playgrounds found little to entertain himself with among the endless trees and rocky outcroppings. My older sister Rebecca spent her time reading books she had brought from home, showing no interest in exploring our temporary wilderness home. My parents were busy with adult concerns, setting up the cabin, establishing routines, and marveling at the natural beauty that surrounded us, but meant little to a bored child. It was on the 8th day of our mountain exile that I first encountered them. I had been wandering aimlessly through the woods behind our cabin, following what appeared to be an old trail that might once have connected the scattered mining settlements. The path led me to a clearing where the foundations of several buildings were still visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. As I stood there trying to imagine what this place might have looked like when it was inhabited, I heard the sound of children laughing. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. We were miles from the nearest house, and I had seen no evidence that any other families were spending their summer in this remote location. But the laughter was unmistakable. The high, clear voices of children at play filled with the kind of pure joy that only the very young can experience. Following the sound, I pushed through a stand of young pine trees and found myself looking at a group of 5 children playing in what had once been the yard of a large building. They appeared to be roughly my own age, dressed in clothes that seemed oddly old-fashioned, but not unusual enough to strike me as particularly strange at first glance. What did catch my attention was how clean and well-maintained their clothing appeared, despite the fact that they were playing in dirt and undergrowth that should have left them covered in grime. The children noticed me immediately and waved me over with enthusiastic greetings. "Come play with us," called a girl with dark braids tied with bright blue ribbons. "We have been waiting for someone new to join our games." Their friendliness was infectious, and within minutes I had forgotten my loneliness and boredom in the excitement of having found playmates in this isolated mountain retreat. They told me their names, Mary, Thomas, James, Sarah, and little Lucy, and introduced me to games I had never heard of before, but that seemed perfectly natural and entertaining. We played hide-and-seek among the ruins, built elaborate forts from fallen branches, and told stories that seemed to transport us to other times and places. What struck me as remarkable was how much these children knew about the history of Pine Ridge. They spoke casually about the mines and the families who had once lived here, describing details about daily life that seemed far beyond what children our age should have known or cared about. When I asked them where they lived, they gestured vaguely toward the deeper woods and said they had always been here, that Pine Ridge was their home and always would be. For the next several weeks, I spent every day with my new friends. I would finish breakfast and immediately head into the woods to meet them at our usual gathering place among the ruins. We explored every corner of the abandoned settlement, played games that seemed to come naturally to all of us, and shared stories that blended seamlessly between imagination and memory. My parents were delighted to see me so happy and active after my initial resistance to our mountain adventure. When they asked about my days, I told them about my friends, describing our games and adventures with the enthusiasm that only an 8-year-old can muster. They assumed I was talking about imaginary playmates, a common and healthy part of childhood development, and encouraged my creative storytelling without asking too many detailed questions. It was my sister Rebecca who first began to notice that something was not quite right. She had started joining me on some of my excursions into the woods, curious about the elaborate games I described and perhaps feeling left out of my obvious happiness. But whenever she accompanied me to the clearing where I met my friends, she found only empty ruins and the normal sounds of the forest. When I pointed excitedly to where Mary and Thomas were playing, she saw nothing but shadows and undergrowth. At first, she teased me gently about my vivid imagination, but as the days passed, her concern grew. She began to notice that I would respond to voices she could not hear, react to events she could not see, and carry on detailed conversations with empty air. More disturbing still, she began to research the history of Pine Ridge and discovered facts that I should not have known, but that I casually mentioned in my stories about my friends. The breakthrough came when she found an old newspaper article in the Charleston Library archives. In the spring of 1952, there had been a tragic accident at the Pine Ridge mining operation. A tunnel collapse had trapped dozens of workers underground, and despite heroic rescue efforts, many lives were lost. Among the victims were 5 children who had been playing near the mine entrance when the disaster occurred. Mary, Thomas, James, Sarah, and Lucy, all between the ages of 7 and 9. When Rebecca showed me the newspaper photographs of the 5 children who had died in 1952, I recognized my playmates immediately. The faces that stared back at me from the yellowed newspaper clippings were the same faces I saw every day among the ruins of Pine Ridge. The clothes they wore in their school photographs were identical to the clothing I had seen them wearing during our games. The revelation should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of completion, as though a puzzle I had been unconsciously working on had finally been solved. These children had been waiting for 35 years for someone to play with them again, someone who could see them and hear them and help them remember what it felt like to be alive and happy and carefree. For the remaining weeks of our stay at Pine Ridge, I continued to spend time with my phantom friends. But now, our games took on a different quality. They began to tell me stories about their lives before the accident, about their families and their dreams and their fears. They spoke about the day the mountain fell down and how they had been playing their favorite game of hide and seek when everything went dark and quiet. Most heartbreaking of all, they told me about the loneliness of the years that followed. Decades of wandering through the abandoned ruins of their former home, calling out to visitors who could not hear them, playing games that no one else could see. They had been waiting, they explained, for someone like me to come along, someone young enough and open enough to bridge the gap between their world and ours. As the end of August approached, my family prepared to return to Charleston. The children of Pine Ridge became increasingly anxious about my departure. They begged me to stay, to convince my parents to make the cabin our permanent home, to promise that I would return the following summer. The desperation in their voices broke my heart. But I was only 8 years old and had no power to make such promises or decisions. On our last day at the cabin, I met my friends one final time in the clearing among the ruins. They seemed dimmer somehow, less substantial, as though my impending departure was already beginning to sever the connection between us. We played our favorite games one last time, told our favorite stories, and made promises that we all knew might be impossible to keep. When the time came to say goodbye, little Lucy clung to my hand with fingers that felt as cold as mountain stream water. "Do not forget us, Benny," she whispered. "Promise you will not forget us, and let us disappear forever." I promised, of course, as any child would promise his friends. But as the years passed and adult concerns took precedence over childhood memories, I found myself thinking less and less about those 3 magical months on Pine Ridge. The memories began to seem like elaborate fantasies, the product of a lonely child's overactive imagination during a boring summer in the mountains. It was not until this past October, 37 years later, that I learned the truth about what had happened to me that summer. I had returned to West Virginia for my father's funeral, and while going through his papers, I found a box of old photographs and documents from our time at the cabin. Among them was a journal my mother had kept during those 3 months, documenting our family's adventure in the mountains. Reading her entries, I discovered details about my behavior that she had never mentioned to me as a child. According to her journal, there were days when I would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found sitting alone in the clearing, apparently carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions. She wrote about hearing me laughing and playing even when I was nowhere to be seen, and about finding me building elaborate structures from sticks and stones that seemed far too complex for a child my age to construct alone. Most disturbing of all, she had documented several occasions when I had returned from my adventures with knowledge I could not possibly have possessed. Detailed information about the mining operations, accurate descriptions of buildings that had been demolished decades before our arrival, and stories about families who had lived on Pine Ridge in the early 1900s. But the final entry in her journal was what convinced me that my childhood memories were more than imagination. On the day before we left the cabin, my mother had found me in the clearing one last time, sitting alone, but clearly interacting with unseen presences. As she watched from the edge of the forest, she saw something that challenged everything she believed about the natural world. For just a moment, in the shifting patterns of light and shadow among the ruins, she caught a glimpse of 5 children playing with their invisible friend. Children who flickered in and out of visibility like figures seen through heat waves, their laughter echoing faintly through the mountain air before fading into silence. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I understand what happened during those 3 months on Pine Ridge. The children who died in 1952 had indeed been waiting for someone to find them, someone who could see past the barriers that separate the living from the dead. For a brief time that summer, I had served as their bridge back to the world of the living, giving them a chance to play and laugh and feel alive again. I have never returned to Pine Ridge, despite the promises I made as a child. Life has a way of pulling us away from the mysteries and magic of our youth, filling our days with responsibilities and practical concerns that leave little room for phantom playmates and ghostly games. But sometimes on quiet summer evenings when the air is still and the shadows are long, I can still hear the faint sound of children laughing somewhere far away in the mountains. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if they are still waiting for me to come back and play with them one more time among the ruins of Pine Ridge, where 5 little ghosts learned what it meant to be children again, if only for a few precious months in the summer of 1987.